Welcome, everyone. I'm Lindsay Gorman, the Managing Director of GMF's Technology Program here at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We're pleased that you're able to join us today for what I hope will be an enlightening and thought-provoking and even maybe a little bit provocative conversation on the future of democracy and technology. Today, we're launching a report that capstones some of our work over the last year and a half on AI and democracy and building innovation that supports democratic values. In our new report, which we released today, called Democratic by Design, Implementing and Innovating Democracy-Affirming Technologies, we explore lessons and findings from two key projects we conducted over the last year in advance of democracy and building those values, privacy, transparency, explainability, into the technologies that we develop today. We are in a moment in society when democracy is under threat, and this project was born out of the idea that democracy as it exists does not happen by accident, and so too need to be the technologies that we develop with democratic values in mind from the very beginning. In an era where regulation is falling out of favor, it cannot be the only safeguard of democratic values in emerging new technologies like artificial intelligence and the myriad applications that artificial intelligence will spawn. Ultimately, this thesis on democracy-affirming technologies is a counter to the idea put forward years ago by the historian Yuval Noah Harari that technology inherently favors tyranny. He argued that autocratic systems have a leg up when it comes to building next-generation technologies. They don't have to care about privacy, particularly for artificial intelligence, which requires massive amounts of data. Autocratic actors and systems can gobble that up, and we're seeing that today. China has more biological and DNA data on the US population than the United States government itself does, and with good reason. We hope that we can build technologies that advance our values. Explainability is another key feature that democracy depends on and autocracy doesn't. We need our systems to be able to hold up in a court of law if they're making critical decisions about financial matters, loan assistance, criminal matters, and autocratic actors and governments do not. So can we build technologies that are a little more thoughtful about democracy? And as you'll see in the report findings and in the esteemed panel of experts we've established here today, there are a lot of creative ideas about how we can do that, from building groups and cadres of entrepreneurs that support these values, to building systems in place, to inspiring the next generation to develop technologies with a little more thought to our democracies than maybe we have in the past. We conducted two projects, as I mentioned, over the course of this last year and a half. The first was a pilot project on content authenticity technologies. These are image provenance technologies that allow users transparency, a core democratic value, in the way they consume information as an antidote to the spread of AI-powered disinformation. We also took these work to the field in the context of Mexico's election, where we hosted a hackathon in Mexico City to inspire innovation on AI and misinformation and disinformation. And I'm delighted that we have one of our hackathon participants here on our panel today, Mr. Jacobo Castellanos, who will talk about his experiences there. Lastly, I would just note that this work at GMF that we're doing, we aren't doing alone. And that's why we've invited experts from fellow civil society organizations, from technology adopters and enablers to discuss and to share their lessons and how we can together build a slightly better, a slightly more democratic future for our technologies. And so with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Adrian Goldstein, one of our co-authors on this new report, to give a brief presentation about some of our findings and some of the work that we did. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. So I'll chat through some of our findings and recommendations before turning it over to our esteemed panel. So this report was a response to what we see as the current dominant innovation landscape, which is often opaque and conceals product design, algorithm, and biases. And in this model, values like privacy and accountability often only show up in regulation, which can lag behind the pace of innovation and results in an uneven application of these values globally. So, what this report argues for instead is the adoption of democracy affirming technologies, or DATs. We define DATs as technologies developed with the intent to protect and promote democratic values, emphasizing principles like transparency, privacy, and accountability. And there are already several exciting examples of DATs that are in development or now coming onto the market, and our panelists will be able to speak to these in greater detail. A few that we mention are privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs, which are a set of methods and tools that protect privacy and data security by transforming how data is represented, stored, and used. Another example are censorship evading technologies, which are a set of tools that protect privacy to allow users to access the internet. A big focus of this report, as Lindsay mentioned, are content provenance and authenticity technologies. And content credentials are a well-known example of these. They act as a sort of nutrition label for a piece of media, and so they embed information about its origin and edit history. This means that users can consume content knowing that it's not an AI deepfake. And long-term, users may become more resilient to information manipulation because they're trained to look for trust signals like content credentials. We used two GMF technology projects over the course of this past year as case studies for the report. The first was on the implementation of existing DATs, and the second on innovating new ones. So as Lindsay mentioned, for the implementation of DATs, in May, we launched a content credentials pilot project where we connected newsrooms and technologists to spearhead the use of content credentials in photojournalism coverage of Mexico's 2024 elections. We then built an image repository from Mexico's and other global elections last year with images that were taken and signed by our project partners. One of our main findings from this project is that newsrooms can use the implementation of DATs, in this case, content credentials, as an opportunity to scrutinize their editorial processes and web display and start to think about accountability and robustness. So they can think through how they decide and declare whether content is authentic. Our second case study was on the innovation of DATs through the AI and Democracy Hackathon. So we asked 8 cross-sector teams to develop a prototype that incorporated AI to address a challenge facing democracy. One of our main findings here was that thoughtful product design can transform existing technologies so that they have democracy-affirming impacts. The winning prototype was Olympia AI, which used a personalized model of facial recognition technology trained on images that the customers uploaded of themselves. It then would scan the internet for deepfakes or other malicious uses of this likeness. Facial recognition technology is obviously not in itself a democracy-affirming technology, but the prototype equipped its users, especially its target audience of women, journalists, and politicians, with tools to be more resilient against these AI-generated harms. Our second finding from the hackathon was that existing tools can adapt to local contexts to be even more innovative. So our second place team was Escudos, and they leveraged existing infrastructure and trust in Mexico to deploy their authenticity scoring tool. Based on these two case studies, we developed a set of policy recommendations for the implementation and innovation of DATs. And these were aimed at policymakers, news media, technologists, and philanthropy. A few of our key recommendations are first that online platforms and websites should incorporate existing DATs into their product design and platform structure. So they can do this, for example, through compatibility with content credentials. Our second recommendation is that we need greater investment in education, such as through DAT research scholarships. Young engineers and researchers need the resources and financially viable pathways to explore this democracy-affirming work. And finally, we recommend that governments and technology companies support red teaming exercises on emerging DATs so that we can identify their vulnerabilities. And they can also fund initiatives to expand DAT deployment beyond their original use cases. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Shanti Kalafel, who's a journalist, a policy advisor, and most importantly, a visiting senior fellow at GMF. Over to you, Shanti.
Great. Thanks so much, Adrienne, and thank you to Lindsay for hosting this event. It's really a pleasure to be moderating this panel, addressing an issue that I've cared about for some time that I think is really at the forefront of how we think about both technology, society, and democracy. It's incredibly important. And Lindsay, I think your point about how do we incorporate values into the innovation, not just regulation, is really an insightful one, and hopefully one that we can explore more in the panel. So let me just take a moment to introduce our terrific speakers today. We've got a wonderful group of experts. First, we have Jacobo Castellanos. He's a part of the Technology Threats and Opportunities team at Witness. And he was one of the founders of Cooperos, one of the first technology cooperatives in Mexico. He participated in the hackathon, and I'm sure he'll have some insights to share from that. Lindsay, you've heard from already, but Lindsay Gorman is the Managing Director and Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Technology Program. Her work focuses on U.S.-China technology competition, including AI policy, quantum information, advanced telecommunications, cybersecurity, and many other issues. And Susan McGregor is a research scholar at Columbia University's Data Science Institute, where she also co-chairs its Center for Data, Media, and Society. She's authored books on these issues, and her research primarily centers on security and privacy issues affecting journalists and media organizations. And finally, to round this out, we have Dr. Lisa Poggiali, who's an anthropologist and tech policy expert who's worked for many years at the intersection of technology, democracy, and geopolitics. She's currently the Global Digital Democracy Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, where she leads efforts on AI, global tech policy, and multi-stakeholder engagement. And previously, she served as a senior advisor on these issues at USAID. So great to have the panel with us. What I thought we could open with is just to have each panelist give a few remarks to start us off. We'll then go to a few moderated Q&As. We'll have a bit of a conversation, and then we can throw it open to our YouTube audience. If you're watching this on YouTube and you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, please just type the question into the chat, and we'll do our best to try and address as many questions as we can. So to start us off, Lindsay, why don't you kick the panel off with some opening thoughts? Over to you.
Thanks so much, Shanti. I definitely said some in the welcome, but I think I really definitely want to hear from our group of experts. But maybe would just pick up on that note by saying that I think this idea really came out of a lot of the work that Shanti and I were thinking about and then conducting when we overlapped in the White House at OSTP and at the NSC in the context of the Summit for Democracy. But it actually predates, which might be news for Shanti, but sort of my thinking about this topic actually predates that and was actually inspired by a question that Shanti asked me the first time I met her, which was back, I think, in 2019. And she asked me, Lindsay, and I was coming from Silicon Valley, from the technology ecosystem, from tech development myself, to DC, and I was sort of new in this kind of think tank space. And Shanti asked me, what do you think it would take for entrepreneurs to care about democratic values? And that question, I think, really inspired at least my own thinking on this topic, that it really needs a whole ecosystem supporting them and to care about those values, including venture funding or quasi-venture funding that would fund companies that are designated and motivated by democratic values, and that there are so many innovators around the country and also around the world that don't just want to sit out this competition between democracy and autocracy, between democratic values and the autocratic ones that's playing out around the world. But it's very hard to break through some of the systems that are already in place. And I think as policymakers and entrepreneurs and policy entrepreneurs and foundations and governments and civil society and researchers, that's really our job to create frameworks societally and in our policies, in our new ideas and new thinking to enable folks who are in the technology field to have a career pathway, as Adrian mentioned, on these technologies. So I think there's a lot we can do. And as I mentioned, we don't have to do it alone. Around the world, there are efforts that are springing up on these things. Shanti and I worked on a couple of them in the context of the Summit for Democracy, where we launched these international grand challenges on democracy affirming technologies around the world. That was, I think, just the beginning. This is the work that we're hoping to continue forward, both with this project and in future directions that you'll hear from on the panel. And would add that I've just spent time in Leipzig, Germany, actually, where I was on the jury for one of these challenges on democracy and technology, specifically on building technology to counter AI and deepfakes and detect and prevent AI and deepfakes from Germany's new innovation agency, Sprind, that is kind of its DARPA equivalent now, trying to address these threats for democracy. So if I have one more opening comment, it's just that there is a groundswell of effort that is interested in thinking about how to make technology work better for democracy than the kind of naive attitude we had in the past that it inherently would, when clearly it hasn't, just by its own. I'm encouraged by the conversation to take that forward and see what new ideas we can come up with and advance together. So thank you.
Great. That's actually, Lindsay, I didn't know that about that question, but it's still relevant today. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so excited both about this panel and the work that the people are doing, because there has been progress. That ecosystem is slowly developing, and you're seeing more new entrants in this space, even if sometimes it's not as quick as we'd like it to be. Why don't we go now to Lisa? Lisa, you have some opening thoughts for us?
Sure. I wanted to start by just really thanking Adrian and Lindsay for the invitation. I think this is such an important conversation, and so just really happy to be a part of it. I'll say just to start that for those of you who do not know what IFES, or the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, does, it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to promote credible elections, democratic participation, and inclusive governance. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing a bit later. But just to start off, we were asked to explore, what is it that we think about when we think about democracy affirming technologies? And I think there are two different axes that I think about this question along. One is foundational, which is what Lindsay and Adrian were mostly referring to in terms of, our democratic values embedded in the actual design of the technology itself. So if we think of accountability as a central democratic value, then can we provide oversight over how that technology is built, right? Is there the possibility for accountability? And I think of Lawrence Lessig, the legal scholar's really profound and brilliant line that code is law, which I think is just so relevant today and so relevant for a conversation about the relationship between the actual law and the sort of code is law theory that Lessig proposes. And what he means is essentially that in digital environments, software architecture, hardware architecture regulates behavior just as effectively and sometimes even more effectively than law does. So like super simple example, if you're looking at a website that's programmed that can't copy text, so it's programmed in a way where you can't copy the text, that code is then enforcing the restriction, regardless of what the law says. So because of the power of these algorithms to regulate behavior, if there's no democratic oversight, then tech companies have the ability to just enforce their own rules without accountability, right? So they're creating, in a sense, private law. So this is one way in which I'm thinking about democracy affirming technologies is how can we help to create code as law in such a way that we're optimizing for the democratic behaviors that we want to see and outcomes that we want to see. And then the second axis is outcome driven. And so is technology bringing about a democratic outcome. So we can think about what Adrian mentioned with regard to content provenance. So in that instance, content provenance technology is being used to push back against disinformation, misinformation, trying to bring about a more healthy information ecosystem. And I'll just end by saying, and we can come back to this, but my biggest concern right now when I look around the world and see how technology is being discussed and implementing is that we're increasingly seeing outcome-driven democracy-affirming technologies that are not necessarily democracy-affirming at the foundational level. And here I'm thinking about digital public infrastructure and the absolute explosion in digital public infrastructure. So platforms that, enable citizens to access services and participate in civic life more. But they're not necessarily open source or able to be, the algorithms are not able to be audited or studied in order to see whether there is any potential harm that could be caused by them. We know that there are many harms. So I'll stop there. But I would love, if others have questions, I would love to discuss this issue more.
Thank you, Lisa. And your point about digital public infrastructure, it's interesting. It goes back to when we used to call these things e-government, and some of those foundational questions are still around even from decades ago, and it's one we should definitely get into. Susan, why don't we go to you next?
Thank you. Yeah, so really, really happy to be here and excited to be having this conversation. I've been deeply involved in the privacy enhancing technology community, both in civil society and academia for a long time, and specifically content provenance is an idea and a concept that I've been working on for almost a decade now. It's been a long time. So I'm really excited to see these things coming together and this conversation happening also at the policy level. I think one thing that I'd like to articulate is that, I think that my experience, I think both sort of in the public sphere, like in sort of the broader ecosystem and at the individual level, right? So as an educator working in a university, often working with computer scientists and students studying computer sciences, is actually that I think that most people who are developing technology want to contribute to the greater good, and they actually think they're doing it, right? So that when they design these technologies, it's not, we might see these as all being like, oh, it's about, and certainly I think it is about money, but I think that one of the challenges is that is not the desire, right, to support democracy or, freedom and privacy and all of those things, but it's really about the skills and the understandings. And that a lot of times one of the challenges we face is that the people who are conceptualizing, designing, and building these technologies don't have a diversity of experience and exposure to understand or even really imagine the ways that they might be misused. And, I know we're going to get into the report more, but I think that that's why I find some of these recommendations so important, things like red teaming, right? Doing kind of a priori assessments in the academic space, in computer security venues and things like that. We're seeing this more, which is basically a requirement to think about how might this be misused. And it might seem obvious, but I think it's, as somebody who, again, works in a university space and in the education space, I think we need to be really mindful of what are the skills that that our students have and are coming in with, what are the skills and understandings that the people in these spaces have and don't have. It's very good for us to say, these are things that people should be doing, but do they really meaningfully have the tools to do it? And I think for those of us who, have a bit broader experience, maybe come from non-technical backgrounds initially, it can seem obvious, right? Through the diversity of lived experience or education or place or whatever. But these things are not obvious if you have not had, if you haven't been sort of on the wrong end of one of these technologies in whatever way. And so I just want to call out that I think that most people are very interested in contributing positively when they design these technologies. And part of what we need to support is that ecosystem that gives everyone the tools both to think about how they can be designed and built in a way that supports, their real values. And that includes the people building them, and that also includes the tools for others to be able to meaningfully critique those tools, right? So the literacies and understandings about technology to be able to say, this doesn't work the way that it should, and here are the ways that, and here's why we should be thinking about it differently. So I think part of this is expanding the conversation and the skill set of people in technology to be thinking beyond technology, and understanding that way.
Great, thank you. And your point about innovation is well taken, the idea of red teaming. I wonder if it's just often that there isn't enough time or space built into the innovation process when you're really, you're set on creating something and there are deadlines. Maybe it's seen as a luxury to be able to think more broadly about harms, which shouldn't be the case, obviously. Jacopo, let's go to you next.
Hi, thank you, Shanti, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund for the invite. So first, some context. I work with Witness, a human rights organization. We've been around for over 30 years now. And in my program, Technology Threats and Opportunities, we've been thinking about emerging technologies and about how they affect the way that video is used to protect and defend human rights. And so about 8 years ago, we started thinking about deepfakes, synthetic media, and how that was changing the landscape and the need for us to understand these technologies, understand how they could impact human rights defenders, how they could impact democracy and journalists, but also what were the responses that we need to come up with and the solutions and the ways that these technologies could also empower people around the world. And so we started focusing on a couple of areas. I think trust and truth is the strong connection to democracy affirming technologies in a world where disinformation is rampant, but also where AI generated content blurs the line between synthetic and organic content, and also not just in terms of the sophistication of these tools. I think we may have all recently seen Google's VO3 come out recently that combines hyper-realistic video with hyper-realistic audio. So these technologies are blurring the lines between synthetic and organic, not just because they're sophisticated, but also because in the a spectrum of possibilities between organic and synthetic, there's a whole array of possibilities of combinations between AI-generated content and human-generated content that makes it a little bit more complicated to understand and identify the source of the content. And so we've been thinking about how do we establish trust and how do we have a collective understanding of truth. And we've been working in several areas. One of them, my work is focused a lot on provenance. And so Witness joined the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is the coalition that has created the technical specifications that underlie the content credentials that Adrienne mentioned at the start. And there we co-chair the Threats and Harms Task Force. And what we've done, there's several areas of work there, but one of the key ones is thinking about how the specifications and then the tools that derive from the specifications can cause harm. And so there I coincide with so many of the things that you said, Susan. And also, Lisa, when you mentioned code is law, I think that we could also expand that idea to think about specifications as well, and how specifications then define how implementations and the tools that are created, what the impact that they have. And so these forms of harm assessment let us know the ways that these technologies could be misused, abused, but also the ways that in which they are used could unintentionally lead to harm. And then one last thing that I'll say is that when we think of content provenance, or when I think of content provenance technologies, I don't think that they necessarily will lead to reaffirming democracy, not if we don't follow through with these harm assessment. For example, privacy is a huge concern. These technologies could be weaponized, and instead of affirming democracy, they could go the whole other way. And so we have to balance these assessments with the diversity of experiences and understanding the ways that they need to be designed and implemented and governed to make sure that they could actually affirm democracy and help us avert and mitigate the harms that they could also bring forth.
Thank you. Well, we've covered a lot of ground just in this opening session. I wonder if we might drill in a little bit more specifically on aspects of tech design. I'd like to ask you all how you think tech design can contribute to upholding some of these values that we've talked about: privacy, accountability, transparency, and what tools have you seen that are already doing this? If you could speak to specific tools or use cases that might help flesh out a little bit for our viewers on this conference to understand a little bit in concrete detail what we're talking about. So why don't Lindsay, I'll go to you first, and then anyone else can also contribute.
So I'll talk about this content authenticity provenance and provenance pilot project that we conducted as part of this project, where we worked with media partners, as Adrian mentioned in the opening presentation, to implement and adopt these content provenance technologies, which I like to think of them as a digital ingredient list or a recipe of how an image travels and how it's made from the point of capture in a camera, or perhaps the point of generation by an AI system, all the way through to your social media feed or your browser when you view it. And it attaches these tamper-resistant metadata about this edit history, essentially, to this image, so that the transparency puts the user back in the driver's seat when it comes to determining whether to trust a piece of visual content. Much in the way that if we read an article and it's very well cited and we can read the individual links and click on those links and drill down on those links to the sources that are cited, we'll have some confidence that the claims being made in the article we're reading are actually supported by the sources that are cited, and we can verify that for ourselves as readers and as users. In the visual domain, that's what these content provenance technologies try to do. Not so much saying what's fake, what's real, but actually putting the user in the driver's seat to make a judgment for themselves on whether to trust an image. So much in the way that if we read an article that has absolutely no citations, we might be slightly more suspicious of the claims. In a world in which every image comes with this metadata attached, we would be inherently suspicious of images that do not. And so what we identified in this project was that the real barrier here is adoption, that this is a new standard, that there's a lot of development, a lot of excitement in the tools, but that it needs broader adoption. So we thought that how can we do that? How can we make a big impact? And that's why we chose Mexico's election, an election in 2024 in June, where there were also two female candidates who are most often targeted by deepfake videos and images, particularly in political life. And one of Jewish origin and one of indigenous and ethnic origin. So these are already sort of pre-positioned groups to be targeted by disinformation, and we did see disinformation in that election. And so we picked this high-profile election as a testing ground to really drive the adoption of these technologies. And we held a workshop where we brought together photojournalists and trained them on how to use these technologies. We brought the content authenticity tech providers who are developing the tools to train the photojournalists, and we brought in international media that we knew would be covering Mexico's election. In the end, we ended up partnering with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and a photojournalist outlet called Obturador MX that Adrian mentioned earlier, where Obturador and the CBC independently took photos of people going to the polls, including the winning candidate, now President Claudia Sheinbaum herself, at the polls, and then digitally sign those images with the content authenticity information. And we published those images, a collection of those images, on our website at the German Marshall Fund as a living tamper-resistant repository of content authenticated images of the 2024 Mexican presidential elections. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was so jazzed up about this idea that they actually took it forward to implement in other elections. So there is, I think, for the first time, a content authenticated photo in major media coverage in an election, and that's CBC's coverage of Mexico's election. They then also did this for their coverage, which had happened earlier, of India's election, and additionally produced photos of content authenticated photos in elections in Canada, even some content from the US election as well. And so that's all in our elections repository. So this is sort of the goal of adoption. And I think one of the lessons that we talk about in the report is that there are a lot of organizational hurdles, particularly in newsrooms, when it comes to building and adopting new technologies that really requires champions to work through. And we had the great fortune of working with two and more incredible champions at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation who were as committed as we are to seeing democracy-affirming technologies in action. And I would say that's really essential to getting these through all the bureaucratic hurdles in organizations large and small when it comes to making sure that what you're putting out really meets the editorial standards. And part of that process also was not just about the business sort of adoption of how do we build a new technology and bring it into the existing workflows, but also having these news outlets like CBC think through, what does it really mean to put our seal of authenticity on this? How do we determine that content is authentic? What are the clues from context, from where the images come from, that we need to put in place? So I think that there are sort of a lot of findings there in the report, and I think Adrian can talk about them in a little more detail. But I would say that project and these technologies, I hope, will be a first step in increasing the adoption and familiarity also with the public of some of these technologies that we can use.
Thanks, Lindsay. And I think you make a great point that it's not just the technologies, it's also the ecosystem surrounding them, right? So the rest of the panel, would you like to jump in on this issue of specific tools and use cases? Lisa, I don't know if you've seen some of this in your experience, whether at USAID or at IFAS.
Sure. I mean, they're sort of the standard bearer, but I always think of Taiwan when I think of this question, because they have done such a great job at both building the kinds of cross-sectoral, cross-stakeholder partnerships that Lindsay described so well with the example that she provided. And then they also are so committed to sort of embedding democratic principles and values into the technology design process. So I think of, for example, the GovZero movement, which it's a civic tech movement that comes out of Taiwan that is committed to building open source and participatory digital tools to help increase public participation in government, increase government accountability, transparency, etc. And I think of one particular tool that was used during the 2020 presidential election, which was a crowdsourcing tool that enabled real-time fact-checking of statements that were made by presidential candidates during their public speeches. So this is one example of going back to what I was saying earlier about kind of foundational democracy-affirming technologies and outcome-driven ones. This combined both of those sort of axes, right? The technology, the platform was designed in a way such that it was open source, transparent. The process of designing it was very participatory. And then also it was geared towards a democratic outcome, i.e. enhancing accountability in the electoral, the process leading up to the election there. And so, I mean, there are many, many other examples, but I think the critical ingredient here is collaboration, openness, and yeah, and really being able to leverage, like to go back to what Susan was saying, the genuine desire of many technologists to be contributing to the greater good.
Great, thank you. Susan, did you have thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as the report highlights, we do have technologies like Tor, which are kind of commercially available. They're available to regular people. And again, in the academic space, there's a lot of exploration of things like privacy preserving technologies. We have zero knowledge proofs. We have privacy preserving federated learning, right? So we have ways that are trying to get at some of the benefits that folks are hoping to realize from machine learning and artificial intelligence, while also doing things like protecting privacy. So these are active areas of research, and a lot of progress has been made in recent years. Differential privacy. I mean, all of these are spaces of active development. Most of them, realistically, most of them are going to be deployed by businesses, by larger companies. And of course, I think we see more active adoption of those, with the exception of the US Census, right? We see more active adoption of those in large projects. These are not things that are necessarily going to be visible to visible or accessible in a particular way to the individual. I do want to just kind of thinking about, what does it take to get these technologies into the world, and kind of picking up on that is the fact that, getting a successful technology is about a lot more than technology, right? You can build a thing, but that is the first, and in some ways, I would argue the easiest part, right? Because the difference between making something that works for people and supporting it and disseminating it and getting traction and awareness, like that is a huge part of it. If it were just about building the technologies, it would be easy, right? And to me, this kind of goes back to, I think, what I was thinking about earlier, but what others have said, which is what is the infrastructure and the ecosystem around these systems and around these innovations and companies, right? I think a lot of us take for granted now, for example, the way the internet works, right? Why do we have the internet that we have? Well, it was actually a massive and very complicated collaboration among government, academia, industry, and there were competing systems, and we ended up with the one that we have for other reasons that were economic and regulatory, right? I mean, even the thing that we built all of this on, right, was not a sure thing to work the way that it does. And it took a massive degree of cooperation and collaboration to get it to work. So I think, that thinking about this as, again, yes, what is the broader ecosystem? So I think, when we think about things like red teaming, security, right, is always a favorite one because, where are the levers of control or influence, right, that are prioritizing certain things over another? And that is, I think, where you get both regulation and you get funding, right? So the fact is that, as, private sector funders, or, nonprofit funders, foundations, right, have the opportunity, government funders, right, have the opportunity to say, you need to do these things as a condition of receiving a certain kind of support. I think one of the challenges right now is that these technologies have evolved a certain economy, right, which is basically a surveillance economy. And so every new iteration of technology that emerges is built on the premise of the last, right? We have AI at the scale that we do because there's so much data available. Why is that data available? Okay, because people can collect lots of data legally currently. And so I think the challenge always is also you're trying to promote the value of a thing that does not yet exist, an unknown positive, right, against the known quantity. And that's always a challenge. And to be honest, I think that's why things like thinking about, how we're preparing the people who go into these spaces, how we think about regulating, what is required. There's obviously many, many instances in history that we can think of where something was very profitable, but also very bad. And in the end, there's not necessarily much beyond, that is what regulation is for at a certain point. And I think that, we also are fortunate to have, for example, in the European Union, we have examples of like what actually happens when we do that, right? So when the General Data Protection Regulation, went into enforcement, prior to that, there was a lot of noise about how this was going to be, the end of everything. I have not seen that end arrive, right? And in fact, what we find is that businesses, including the businesses that we would expect to push back hardest against these things, because part of their business model depends on the way things already work, have actually found new business opportunities in compliance, right, as a service, So I think the fact is that we have to accept that when we have a status quo, the the actors in the space that are benefiting from that status quo are inevitably going to push back. And this is, in a sense, yes, of course, it's important to work organically with the people who are thinking about these things and actually building these technologies. But we also have to think about the levers of governance that are in place precisely for this reason, or that are available precisely for this reason, and not let a sort of doomsdaying, but then everything's going to fall apart, stop us from pushing towards those opportunities.
Thanks, Susan. Jacopo, I know at Witness, you've probably seen many of these use cases. Can you talk about one or two from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I actually can maybe relate to the example that Lindsay talked about. I think that effort to bring these technologies to the world and make them useful and effective in practice, these efforts are super valuable, which is why I value the hackathon that you organized in Mexico City, but also just to recognize how complicated it is. And to Susan's point, in the case of provenance and the content credentials in particular, these technologies can only be useful to the extent that they are implemented interoperably and fairly widely, right? So if we take the example of the images that may have been taken, that you mentioned, Lindsay, were taken during the Mexican elections, these images in and of themselves could prove very useful, because they give us these indicators of authenticity for us to know that they're real. But if they are then published on Instagram or TikTok or what have you, and these systems are not prepared to validate and process this information, then at the end of the day, the user is not going to see the information that was captured originally. And so this just speaks to how complicated it is creating this interoperable system. And again, how do you regulate it? To Susan's point again, because for each one of those, there's different responsibilities, there are different requirements that need to be accomplished. At Witness, what we talk about often is the pipeline responsibility. For these technologies to be effective while also tackling these harms, each one of these stakeholders across the pipeline need to fulfill a number of requirements. So at the level of the model developer, for example, or the model provider, the extent to which they too input data into their systems that has this provenance and this verifiable information already gives a leg up, so that once the user creates content, we have a trail of information that gives more information, that facilitates understanding and facilitates the possibility of the user coming up with ways by which they determine what they believe in or not. And so this is happening right now. I do want to say that this ecosystem is being created, and it's growing in terms of regulation, in terms of adoption of these technologies. I think there's more to be done in terms of media literacy, but also making it more inclusive and making all of this process iterative, because as these technologies are being implemented, we're also learning a lot. And the more people that use them, and the more diverse group of people that use them, the more information that we have to make this process iterative and make it better and better, hopefully.
Thank you. I want to take a step back. We talked at the beginning of this about the incentive structure for the creation of these democracy affirming technologies. I'd like to put it to the panel. How do you see this incentive structure for the innovation landscape right now? And what type, Susan, you talked about this a little bit, but what type of obstacles does that present for democratic values or the development of democracy affirming technologies? I think we know a little bit about this, but if anybody wants to jump in and elaborate a little bit more. Susan, maybe we can go to you first.
I mean, I think thank you, and I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I think the challenge is simply that it's again, there's a known quantity. I will also point out there's a known quantity to the way that the economic model of these systems works today, right? And the concern is always, if you change that, right, what happens? I will highlight something else that complicates this, right, which is the legal position of many of these companies, absent regulation, especially, I can really speak to only to the US context, right, which is they have shareholders. So there's a lot of, irrespective of what individuals at, companies, may want. But when we're talking about publicly traded companies, they have a legal obligation to their shareholders. And if they take action that compromises shareholder value, they can be sued. And in fact, if anyone remembers sort of the Cambridge Analytica thing, for a minute, Facebook was sued by a whole host of states, or it was in the process of being sued by a whole host of states for compromising shareholder value. So nobody likes to say regulation, but the fact is that for the large publicly traded companies, if they take steps that harm their bottom line, they face legal liability. And the only way to thread that needle is to be legally required to do things differently. And so I think that's why we see, again, it's not something people like to talk about. Now, obviously, in other situations, if it's not a publicly traded company, you're talking about something like venture capital, you're talking about, again, government funding, foundation funding, all of these things, there's a lot of leeway. But, I would just say that at the moment, like I've been thinking about content authenticity in terms of text for a long time, because that's a space that's very familiar and important to me. So similar to what the image space, but a slightly different problem. The underlying technologies are very similar, but it's another thing to do. There's a cost associated with that, even if the technologies are free, right? Implementation is never free because we have to change systems, we have to educate, we have to, there's a cost. There's just a production level cost to making any kind of change. And the question is, can we prove that it's worth it, right? Can we demonstrate that there is greater value? When I think about the media ecosystem, I think media organizations are really hungry for opportunities to improve public confidence and public trust. Obviously, this has an impact for their bottom line, but on any given day, there are a lot of things that need doing. And the question is, and I think the media industry in particular has had whiplash with, pivot to this and pivot to that, and a ton of money goes into it. And the question is, has that helped? And I think that's where the real challenge lies, is that we know that this is something like content authenticity, which I personally really believe in as an important mechanism for improving trust and credibility and all of that, and just the value of digital information, period, right? I mean, I think we're approaching a point where it's like nobody believes anything, and then nobody has any value to offer. But again, there's a cost there to implementing it, and it's very hard for us to say, do this, and 10 years from now we promise, you'll be seeing the value return on it. And so again, I think that's where funding helps, and also requirements from funders.
Let me go to Lisa, because you spent some time at a big government funding organization and you've seen things from that perspective as well as from civil society. How do you think that the incentive structure can be pushed to change to accommodate more democratic values?
So I can start off by answering that question from the perspective of government. And then I also think when you were mentioning potential obstacles related to the incentive structure and the production of more democracy affirming technologies, I can also speak to a new initiative that we have at IFAS that addresses that. So in my previous role in government, I would say one of the number one things that, so there are many different things that the government can do in order to support different kinds of incentive structures, right? There's the education piece. So the government can work with accreditation institutions, for example, in order to accredit universities that have programs that teach students, teach engineers, computer scientists, et cetera, about democracy affirming technologies, and ensure that those values are built into the curricula. So this is also something that Taiwan does very well. There's, of course, research funding. And this is, I think, one of the most concerning things about the huge cuts to research, the NSF, for example, that we've seen recently, is that so much government funding goes into, the production of innovation and to university experimentation and research on technologies. And so governments could create a different kind of incentive structure by supporting things like research and development of privacy enhancing technologies, for example, content authenticity tools. They can support digital literacy initiatives, for example. So, and to Jacobo's point, I think it's so critical, the point about digital literacy and scale being a critical component of the successful uptake of these types of technologies, especially in an environment where truth and trust are such big question marks for so many people. Um, and so I'll pivot a little bit to discuss this initiative because it's very relevant for thinking about how to enhance more civic-minded innovation that is democracy affirming, particularly in the global South. So IFES is about to launch a new initiative called the AI Advisory Group on Elections, or AI Age. And I'm very pleased that Lindsay Gorman is one of the members of that, in addition to Sam Gregory, the executive director of Witness, and Audrey Tang, Benjamin Prudhomme from Mila, the Quebec AI Institute, Miranda Bogan from Center for Democracy and Technology, and many, many others. We have a group that I think is 12 experts deep. And the idea is to bring together those experts with electoral authorities in order to collaborate over a sustained period of time to address AI specific related threats and challenges and leverage AI related opportunities. And one of the pillars of this initiative is, as I said, fostering local AI innovation that is democracy affirming and civic minded. And so there are many challenges that electoral management bodies face that technology can be leveraged in order to address. I think content provenance is one potential direction to explore, and the work that Lindsay and Adrian have done in Mexico, I think, is a really great starting point and will provide a lot of lessons for thinking about how to incorporate more, more of these types of technologies into the political system and electoral processes. But I think so what we are trying to do is drive also collaboration between the local innovators and the electoral authorities. And this has, I think, the added benefit of also helping to deepen trust between stakeholders that oftentimes do not trust one another. And if you don't have trust in those who are manning the technology of an election, you certainly don't have trust in the political process overall. And so I think there are many things that can be done in order to enhance incentives for this type of integration into government structures and electoral context specifically. I'll say the obstacles are certainly many, trust being one of them, but also there are, of course, many legal and regulatory barriers in different countries to the development of civic innovation markets, right? And so this goes back to why it's so important from a government perspective that governments think about how to create an ecosystem in which democracy affirming technologies can thrive, whether that's related to research and funding for research, like I mentioned before, policy initiatives, or legal and regulatory issues around tax policy or competition policy, or data localization policy, right? Like all of these are very critical to creating an ecosystem where we can help to enhance more local innovation that is civic minded and indeed democracy affirming.
Thank you. I was really struck by your term civic innovation markets, and I wonder, maybe going back to what Susan said, is there a way to actually have these be competitive in a market as opposed to being sort of nonprofit backed or philanthropic activities that we insert into the ecosystem almost artificially. I think that's part of what I grapple with a lot on this question. Lindsay, I don't know if you have thoughts on this. We obviously tried to spur some of this innovation when we worked together at the White House and through the Summit for Democracy. How do you see this question? And you bid it in Silicon Valley. Is there a possibility for real market-based solutions to some of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Shanti. And I think it is the key one because we can't just build technologies that we like that have our values in if no one is going to use them because they won't win the day. So these need to be attractive solutions. They need to be market ready. And that's a lot of the adoption work that we're trying to do. But I think there is a role for these maybe artificial injections of to cross market hurdles. And in innovation policy and industrial policy, we actually have a long history of doing that, not with necessarily democracy affirming technologies, but some of the technologies that the US Defense Department has been instrumental in funding have now blossomed from the iPhone to the internet across modern life. So I think we dare not maybe underestimate the role of these maybe artificial injections into the innovation economy to cross kind of these market barriers that governments can provide, that actors beyond just the nebulous market forces can provide. And I think it's figuring out in this environment where are these targeted interventions that we can make. But to your question and your point, it's also about the innovation ecosystem around technology development that will help with this too. So I think making these technologies market ready, attractive to be used, usable, uh, it's an all of the above approach. It's not only injecting the capital in from artificial sources, it's not only coming up with governance ideas about what should be developed, what needs to be developed, how it should be governed, but it's also about building entrepreneurs that care about these values so that even in the companies of tomorrow, the big tech companies of tomorrow, there are actors thinking about these questions. It's about venture capitalists who want to go out on a limb and fund companies that are good for democracy, that embed these values in to create this innovation ecosystem. I don't think there's any one actor that's going to solve this problem, and I think we have to recognize that it's perhaps a bit of an uphill climb. But one of the things that I think is so great about technology is that nothing lasts forever and that every new generation has these upstarts and these disruptors. And so how can we drive these disruptors to think more about democracy? And some of these initiatives, like with Germany's Sprint, I think are exactly the kinds of things that we need, where there's a challenge, which is, and which we started in our hackathon. There's a challenge that we have the societal problem, make a company that is viable, that has a customer base, that has a strong business plan to help solve that societal challenge. And sometimes that's going to require a little bit of a detour. For example, in deepfake detection, of course, the ready application is journalism, fact checking, helping the media figure out what's real and what's not when it comes to images and video, and audio as well. But there are also many other industries that have to do this reputation management and care deeply from a financial sense in regards to their bottom line about verifying trusted information from financial services to insurance, even to e-commerce. When you get a product and you want to make sure that it's authentic or you have a complaint about its damage, these are kind of things that need to be verified, that it's not just spurious information. So there are market use cases. So I think it's really about marrying up this sort of grand democracy affirming vision with how do we get these technologies into market in a way that's practical, in a way that's cost effective, in a way that has a strong customer base, even outside of these kind of more traditional democracy affirming use cases.
Thanks, Leslie. That's
Could
a great way of framing that out. Hope, I don't know if you want to come in on this question of incentives, particularly, I think from the human rights space, it must be an interesting one to contemplate.
Yeah, I could. So I think first, I think the kind of little bit of a pushback to civic innovation based on markets is that I'm not sure that in the political landscape we've established the basic threshold of understanding of what are the underlying values that should shape our society. Like it seems like maybe this may be a little bit too anecdotal, but even talking about human rights, it seems like it's more and more contentious, right? So I think, before we start building um, innovation based on markets, we have to go back and sort of like hold the line and agree what are these underlying values. Democracy, human rights are under these underlying values, and we build innovation on top of that. And then market incentives come from that. And so that's just a short interjection to mention that. But I know Susan was going to say something, so.
Yeah, Susan, you had a quick comment to come back on?
Yeah, I just wanted to tag on, and I mean, completely agree with Jacobo, right? Like we can't skip those conversations. But I just wanted to point out, a lot of the companies that we think about as being the big successes today ran on years of free money, right? I mean, they ran on venture capital. They were not profitable, right, for many years. And so I think part of this, I mean, maybe in addition to going back to first principles, what are we trying to support here in terms of values, is also kind of reframing and elevating what we think of as a successful business, right? I mean, a business that doesn't go public, or that doesn't get bought out, that cycle, the economic cycle of venture capital that governed for 30 years, right, does not function any longer. And I think one opportunity here is also to elevate those smaller companies that are making a real product that serves a real market. And maybe they're not unicorns, but they're making money, and they're actually serving their customers, and really highlighting those and elevating those, so that people understand that it's not just one way. And I think there are examples of angel investors and smaller venture capital funds that are focusing on these kinds of things and are making real products for real customer bases, and getting more attention on those, so people understand that it's not one or the other. I think could be incredibly valuable, and in my experience is not really part of the exposure system that we have right now for people thinking about building technology.
Thanks, Susan. That's a great point. At this point, we'd like to open it up to the audience on YouTube. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat, and we'll try to get to you and get it to our panelists. Let me pose one question from the chat from Andrew, who's asking, how can democracies become more proactive in shaping the information environment in an era of global interconnectivity and associated vulnerabilities? So kind of a big question, but feel free to bite off whatever part of that you'd like to. Is there anyone that'd like to jump in? Then I'll probably just call on somebody to take that one if you'd like to. Uh, Adrian, you're not on camera. I don't know if you'd like to. You've been working on this report. Maybe you have some thoughts on that. Or Lindsay, maybe.
Sure, sure. Happy to take this one. And thanks, Andrew, for the question. I think it's definitely a loaded one. But uh, yeah, I think we've talked a lot about sort of what democracies can do in the innovation landscape and the ecosystem. I mean, one of the recommendations from the report that I think, is really compelling is about, what are the tools by which we can build this kind of next generation of entrepreneurs. And I think this is where democracies may have a slightly easier time than in trying to sort of shape or control the entire information environment, which, let's face it, has become quite the political minefield, as it has been a battlefield between democracy and autocracy for such a long time now. But one of our recommendations, which I think does apply to democratic governments as well as democratic actors, is actually to fund and create these research scholarships that are based on the development of democracy affirming technologies. privacy enhancing technologies, content authenticity technologies, explainable artificial intelligence. Let's create maybe through the National Science Foundation, for example, in the United States, or associated scientific research organizations in other countries. Let's create these research scholarships. The Defense Department, for example, gives so much money to universities and researchers to fund technologies that are going that may be used in the future of armed conflict where we want the US to lead. Let's do the same thing when it comes to these democracy affirming technologies. So I think greater funding for these kinds of initiatives and the creation of pathways and career pathways for folks who want to get into this too. I think Susan's original point that a lot of technologists do want to develop in the public interest. Let's give them the tools to do that. So I think maybe that's one small thing, that one small finding that came out of our report from the hackathon and from some of this adoption work that we did that where yeah, democracies can help shape this information environment from maybe a few steps removed from the sort of current climate that we usually think about it, where I think a lot of it has devolved into a question of the narratives as opposed to the infrastructure that's underlying them.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Lisa, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add one point on the narrative, although I agree that the infrastructure is extremely important. And in a sense, it's also about the infrastructure because I think democracies can also help to support independent journalism. I think one of the major issues when we think about the information environment is there's just so much noise, right? I mean, between coordinated and authentic behavior, between platforms monetizing with advertising noise. I mean, there's just so much information that we are constantly bombarded with, and people are looking for places to trust. So I think one thing that democratic governments can do is to really invest in public media, right? Developing kind of trusted sources that people can look to when they're seeing so much on social media that is very confusing. So, I mean, there's a million things that we could talk about when it comes to the information environment, obviously, but I think that is one that is very concrete, like continuing to support funding for public media.
Thank you, Lisa. And Adrian, are you available to come in on this question now?
Yeah, a few things that come to mind are helping with infrastructure, as Lindsay and Lisa have mentioned, as well as standardization and definitions. So government, for example, can create public use data sets using privacy preserving trusted data that can help with building more resilient AI systems, for example. And they can also help define some of these democracy preserving technologies so that there's better understanding among the public and standardization of what we mean when we say explainable AI, for example. And so NIST has already begun some of this work, but I think there's a big opportunity to help with the standardization of these terms.
Great. Thank you. I did want to get a sense, we've talked a lot about government's role in pushing this forward. We've heard a little bit about that, but I would like to hear from our folks, both on the civil society side and on the academia side. Where do you see your sector playing a role in driving technology that supports democracy? So maybe, Jacopo, I can go to you first and talk about civil society's role specifically in this space.
Yeah, and actually I can connect it to the previous question as well, because I think one space where more civil society participation could be useful and very impactful is, again, standardization. And also considering this global interconnected world, I'm from Ecuador, and when I think of the possibilities that regulation or the impact that regulation can have on big companies operating in our country, they're still very limited in many ways. And so, but when I think of the impact that governments and civil society as well could have on standards, that's one way to have a very strong impact on how these technologies operate in different countries and globally. and in a way that perhaps cannot be reached by governments in their specific countries if they're smaller, and by civil society as well. I can say a couple of key examples from our work in the C2PA that I think are extremely impactful. So one of the things that we advocated for continuously is that personally identifiable information should not be included into the spec itself. They could be added separately in add-on technology. But if we manage to not included in the specifications, that is one way to make it just a little bit harder for PII to be weaponized in authoritarian regimes, for example. And so, and that is just one small action that could have very strong impact across the world as these technologies are implemented. And so, yeah, just to go back to the question, civil society participation in standardization is very impactful. But I do want to recognize that that is not easy. It requires also, going back to Lindsay's point, funding. It requires funding as well, but it also requires changing the structure of how these organizations work and how they make space to talk about human rights. It's often the case that talking about human rights in these spaces seems a little bit awkward because we're supposedly in technical spaces. So we need to change a lot of things. But the extent to which we can imbue civil society participation, I think that's one very impactful way to do it.
Thank you. You know, we've been iterating on this multi-stakeholder model now for a few decades, but I think in terms of these processes, especially the technical processes, there's still a ways to go. Susan, did you want to talk a little bit about academia's role in this space?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, I think Jacobo touched on something, it's just like right at the end there, right, that I wanted to pick up on, which is this idea of, oh, we're not supposed to talk about human rights in the context of a technical space, right? And I think that, one thing that we're seeing, at the Data Science Institute at Columbia, that we're always working on, right, is things like how do we think about data science and artificial intelligence and what they can bring to disciplines across the university, spaces across the world. But likewise, also, is the reverse thread, right? Which says, what can those outside spaces bring to these disciplines? And I think that sort of divide that we have, this sort of artificial divide that says, there's technical and there's everything else. That is where universities have a real opportunity for leadership, right? So all the work that we do at DSI is very interdisciplinary, and that's on purpose because you can't actually disentangle the two, right? I mean, one of the things that we've talked about is that, is that the getting things out there, getting things that are usable, getting things that are useful, right? And that support these values is as you say, a multi-stakeholder problem. I think one very simple thing that universities can do is to expand their thinking and their education of students who are in these technical disciplines to broaden to broaden their awareness, broaden their understanding, to bring these issues in earlier, to say, hey, these are things that to think about, right? And that's something that we've done at Columbia and at DSI with the courses that we offer. We challenge students who are maybe used to thinking that computer science, right, is just technical, right? But understanding that those tools, those technologies you built are going out into the world, right? A computer in a room is just a pile of plastic, right? It doesn't do anything without humans interacting with it. And so I think that universities need to be thinking about educating the whole person and the whole student for the way that these technologies are going to exist in the world at all levels. And I'd say that, undergraduate, master's level, and the PhD level, because the reality is a lot of our doctoral candidates are the ones who are going to go into industry. They're the ones who are going to go and be the founders, right? Because they have that depth of knowledge. So I think education has a huge role to play in thinking about how we, again, give people the tools to really generate the outcomes that they want when they think about making these technologies.
Great, thank you. Lindsay, you wanted to talk a little bit about think tanks in this space.
Yeah, just maybe one small note on sort of how think tanks can join this effort too. From our experience, is I think being willing to go outside the traditional bounds of what we might normally do and consider as our mandate and our remit when it comes to the types of work we do. I think throughout this initiative, we've had a lot of firsts. I think it's not it's not normal for a think tank to host a hackathon, even though that's a quite common thing in the technical world. This is certainly the first that the German Marshall Fund ever put on, and afterwards we got some questions from peer institutions who were interested in also holding a hackathon. And I think if it's only the traditional technical organizations holding these competitions, then the values that we're talking about are never going to be at the center of them. So being willing to do something that isn't just a standard transatlantic convening that GMF is, excellent at, but taking the chance on going into something new and finding partners who are willing to take a chance on non-traditional think tank programming. Let's just call it what it is, whether it was the hackathon or this pilot project on content credentials, which is more kind of like the do tank aspect of some of our work and less about coming up with theories and ideas and academic research than we might normally put out. So I think, if you read our report, it doesn't really come off as a typical research report. We do identify recommendations for policymakers and all various stakeholders, but they're based on these kind of readouts from these two projects. So yeah, thinking creatively about what's actually needed, because what we thought that was needed was actually the adoption. It wasn't just the innovation piece, but how do we sort of help get across the barriers that exist, and think about our role maybe in a slightly different way that can push the bounds a bit and would encourage our friends, who are also, I think, quite committed to these goals, to similarly and perhaps coming up with new ideas for how to push the boundaries of our work.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we're talking about innovation, but the innovation is really incumbent upon all the players in this space, not just the tech companies. And I think there's actually plenty of room for everyone to really lean into the innovation here, whether it's think tanks, academia, civil society, or what have you. So we're just about at the end of our time, and I'd like to go back to the panel just to provide maybe a couple of wrap-up thoughts on what we've discussed today. If you could maybe sum up or get to a point that you'd like to make that you didn't get to make before, but if you want to put a cap on what you've been saying and maybe come away, what is your main conclusion on this issue of democracy affirming technologies and the way that we create a better innovation ecosystem to support this? So, Lindsay, why don't I go back to you first on that?
Sure, I'll keep it brief, and actually would love to have also Adrian come in here and maybe give a last note from our work. But I would just say that this is whole of society, and that I think it's easy to kind of get down in the dumps when it comes to democracy, with all the challenges thrown at it these days. But if you go into the innovation community, there's just such enthusiasm and such optimism about the future of these technologies. And so bringing the two together, I think is really critical, that there are more actors in this contest and in this fight than you might think. Um, and that there is a lot of really compelling work to be done at this intersection that isn't the same old conversations over and over again. And so I hope that's what we would impart in our work, and really excited to join the initiative that Lisa mentioned about the AI age, with electoral systems and responsible AI there. So great to see that a lot of these initiatives are springing up, and would encourage more of them.
Great. Adrian, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think, in this report and as our program, we still are holding on to this idea that democracy is a really attractive offer, and democracy will sort of win out ideologically, but we need to support that. And so whether that's through research scholarships or training data or infrastructure, there's a lot of opportunity to bolster democracy in tech innovation and deployment.
Okay, great. We did just have one last question come in talking about what's the responsibility in providing a reliable training data pipeline of verified information for AI? Susan, would you like to wrap that into your closing comments?
Yes, and thank you for the question. I think I'm not entirely sure the context in which you mean this, whether you mean, and this is from a news organization, whether you mean for yourself or others. For yourself, obviously, you want to make the most of it. And if you are thinking about training data for others, I would say do not underprice it. The fact is that high quality information is extremely valuable. In fact, given all the noise and nonsense out there, it is more valuable today than arguably it was 50 years ago, because so much of what is out there is not reliable, is not accurate. And so I think, again, as we're talking about markets, we also have to be very rigorous in not, in not giving away the thing that has value. And the fact is that doesn't necessarily mean keeping it to yourselves. And I think you can be thoughtful if you want to share it or make it more available to like-minded organizations. I think that's one thing to do. But I think one thing that we're seeing right now, and this is across the board, is there is a data extraction problem wherein everyone's data is expected to be handed over for free to companies that then make a ton of money off it, right? And the people who are providing that data, whether it's a social media user, right, or a news organization, are expected to create a lot of value and get very little for it. And that kind of asymmetry is something that we have to push back on, frankly, if we're going to not distort that market. So that would be my quick thing would be make sure you get paid for it, and you get paid for it as you should.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Jacopo, to you next.
I'll just a short, brief comment. I think we need more global, diverse participation in the design of technologies and the implementation of technologies, the deployment and the regulation. And the more that we can achieve that, I think the more that we can get closer to democracy affirming technologies.
Thank you. Short and sweet. And Lisa?
So I mean, we're at such a critical moment right now when we look out across the world. We are seeing a new model of global power develop, where nation states and big tech companies are collaborating in ways that they have not in the past. I think we're looking out across the landscape and seeing the rise of what some have called techno-monarchy. And so I think being very clear-eyed about the fact that there are really large challenges and a lot of interests that are not going to make it easy to establish democracy affirming technologies as the sort of standard. But with that being said, I do think, and this has been, since I was researching and then teaching at Stanford with many computer scientists in my classes, that technologists are the biggest untapped sort of population when it comes to advancing democratic priorities. And I do think we have a lot of work to do, as Adrian said, in terms of, making democracy attractive again, and really highlighting what the benefits are. But I do think that without technologists being a central part of this conversation, we're not going to go anywhere. And so I think all of the things that we mentioned in terms of funding, in terms of building, democracy affirming approaches into the education models for engineers and computer scientists, all of this is so critical.
That's a great point and a great note to wrap up on. I think we've all touched on this in various ways over the course of our event today, but it's clear that the future of democracy and the future of technology are really bound up together. And so the choices that technologists make in this space, the choices that governments, civil society, academia, think tanks, all the players in this space, they really are critical to how our future is going to develop. And it's a conversation really for all. So I wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us on YouTube today. It's been a really rich conversation. And thank you, of course, to our wonderful panelists for providing your insight. It's been a really rich discussion, and I really appreciated the chance to moderate today. So thank you again for joining us, and that's it for today.